What's up guys, this is Mohammed, and this is a full detailed review of the best drone of 2020, the DJI Mavic Air 2. So I've had the Mavic Air 2 for about 4 months now, and I've used it on well over 20 professional paid gigs and lots of personal shoots as well. And I can say this drone does everything I want and more. So I'm going to divide this review into two sections, the positives and the negatives, just like I did with the original Mavic Air review. And we'll start with the positives because they far outweigh any of the minor negatives this drone has. First up, and by far the most important thing, image quality. Now, this is one area where the Mavic Air 2 is greatly improved over the Mavic Air. The sensor is slightly bigger, and now it can shoot 4K all the way up to 60 frames per second. Now, this new sensor is also a quad Bayer sensor, which means instead of having the RGB pixels right next to each other, there's 4 of them. That means now it can take up to 48 megapixel images from a 12 megapixel native sensor. Compared to the 12 megapixel images, the 48 megapixel images are much sharper and more crisper and have more detail, but they're not as rich looking as the images coming from the Mavic 2 Pro, which has a 1-inch 20 megapixel sensor, because that sensor is 1 inch and is much bigger than the Mavic Air 2 sensor. So what does the slightly bigger sensor get you? Well, in comparison to the original Mavic Air, the image here is a bit more organic and there's less noise in the shadows. I would say the noise ratio is good up until ISO 800, and with a little bit of noise reduction, ISO 1600 is also usable. Whereas the original Mavic Air, the image would start to get mushy and become unusable really quick. Now with the Mavic Air 2, we also get new compressions in the form of H.265. Now the H.265 files look better than the H.264 because they're less compressed, but be ready to render some proxies because your computer is not gonna like those H.265 files. So overall, I'm very happy with the image quality coming from the Mavic Air 2. This is the only Mavic drone that can shoot 4K 60, and I shoot 90% of weddings and real estate videos in 4K 60 because I like having the ability to, at any point I like, turning the footage into smooth slow motion. That meant that with the original Mavic Air, I was shooting mostly 2.7K because that was the highest resolution that offered 60 frames per second. Speaking of high frame rates, this is the only Mavic drone that offers 240 frames per second in 1080p mode. Now, I have not used this mode much because I don't really see a use case for it, and also the image quality is quite poor. Next is the connection. The Mavic Air 2 finally has OcuSync 2.0. No more Wi-Fi connection drops. If you had watched my review of the original Mavic Air, you'd know that I spent a lot of time talking about why I really dislike the Wi-Fi connection of the original Mavic Air. It constantly dropped connection, the feed quality was poor, and there was a severe delay, and it was just unreliable, which is not something you want when flying a drone. Thankfully, DJI fixed that with the Mavic Air 2, and now we have OcuSync 2.0, which is wonderful. I have taken this thing way out there. On some real estate gigs, I think I had at least 10 different buildings between me and the drone, and there wasn't a single drop in the connection. It's a rock solid connection. It's reliable and you feel insured while flying it, which means you dare to fly it further and higher. Next up is the new controller. And I love this new controller. Yes, it's way bigger than the original Mavic Air controller, but it's also way better. The grip feels much better in hand, and now the phone goes on top instead of the bottom, which is a more natural place for a display. The sticks are slightly longer, which somewhat alleviates the 8 direction problem I had with the original Mavic Air's controller. So the problem is these joysticks have an 8 direction range of movements, where, for example, you go up and you go, for example, to a 45-degree angle and it locks into place. You see how I can't easily move it, down or up from here, and the issue that it causes is that it's harder to get very smooth movement, like going up to down without it falling into these holes. And it's much easier and quicker to take out and fully assemble. The battery life is now rated at 32 minutes of flight time, and in my experience in a windy city like Istanbul, it's pretty close to that. I usually get around 29 to 30 minutes of flight time with the Mavic Air 2, whereas with the original Mavic Air, I used to get around 18 minutes. So it's almost double the battery life, and I'm pretty happy with it. Some time ago, DJI introduced digital zoom modes into the Mavic Air 2 via firmware update. This allows 2 times digital zoom in 4K up until 30 frames per second, 2 times digital zoom in 2.7K until 60 frames per second, and 4 times digital zoom in 1080p up until 60 frames per second. In my testings, I found that the digital zoom modes only slightly hinder the image quality and is way better than just cropping the image in post. So starting with the 4K modes, I have the 4K wide option on the right side and the 4K 1.3 times zoom on the left side. And as you can see, the 1.3 times zoom is much more clearer than the 4K wide mode. Now here's the 4K wide mode on the right and the 4K 2 times digital zoom on the left. I'm again zoomed in at 200% in the 4K wide mode and at 100% in the 2 times zoom. And look at that, the 2 times zoom is so much better and so much clearer than the 4K wide mode. This is really impressive. This is effectively giving you 3 focal lengths in 4K. The only other Mavic drones that give you different focal lengths are the Mavic 2 Zoom, which has an optical zoom lens, and the Mavic 2 Pro, which has a crop mode. But now you have it in the Mavic Air, and the results are really impressive. So for the 4K mode, I would say, hands down, if you need to shoot something that's further away, instead of shooting just normal 4K and then cropping in post, use the digital zoom. Now moving on to the 2.7K mode. I have the 2.7K wide mode on the right and the 2 times zoom on the left. And I should say this is shot at 2.7K at 60 frames per second. And I would say the differences here are not as pronounced. The 2 times zoom looks slightly sharper than the one on the right than the 2.7K wide mode, but that's about it. It's not as big of a difference as it was with the 4K modes. Now moving on to 1080p. I shot this at 1080p at 60 frames per second, and the default wide mode is on the right, and on the left we have the 2 times zoom mode. And as you can see, we have the same story here. The 2 times zoom is much more clear. Moving on to the 3 times crop, and it's the same. The 3 times crop is so much more clear. Just see how much more clarity the zoom mode has, and that is incredible. Now here's the 4 times zoom on the left, and for reference I've zoomed in the wide mode into 400%, and as you can see the differences are huge. So whatever DJI is doing with this digital zoom mode, it's working. You get much better results shooting with the zoom modes in camera rather than just cropping the footage in post. It's a great beneficial tool to have to get closer to your subject without actually getting the drone physically close to it. If you haven't seen that video, it's up here or here. Overall, I think it's great that DJI is adding new features into the drone via firmware, and I think they should be commended for it. You can even do pseudo dolly zoom shots, because while in the zoom mode, if you hold down the function button and use the wheel here, instead of tilting the gimbal, you can manually control the zoom. Lastly, the build quality of the drone itself. Now, I know this area is not as important as, say, like the build quality of a camera, because you're not going to be holding the drone in your hands much, but this is a very well built drone. In terms of wind resistance, it's rated up to 38 kilometers per hour, and I would say that's pretty accurate. Living in a notoriously windy city like Istanbul, I've never had the Mavic Air 2 drift or lose its position. It's a champ in that regard. This is the Istanbul wind we're talking about. Can fly the drone by itself. Look at it! Oh my god! That's insane! Now here are the negative points of the Mavic Air 2. There isn't a whole lot, but there are a few things that I thought I should share. First and foremost, my biggest gripe with the Mavic Air 2 is that you don't get a log picture profile. You only get a flat picture profile, which grades nicely, but has a limited dynamic range. And there's no way to change the settings of the picture profiles to bring down the contrast to get a little bit more dynamic range. It's frustrating. There is an HDR mode, but it's limited to only 30 frames per second in 4K. I did some tests comparing the HDR mode to the flat picture profile, which you can see up here, and because the HDR mode is taking advantage of the quad Bayer sensor, it's exposing shadows and highlights differently, so you get a really wide dynamic range. But because it's computational and it's always in auto mode, at times where you're flying over some textured terrain like a forest or an area where there's a lot of light coming in from different directions, you'll see that it's constantly changing the exposure, which means those shots are basically useless. However, I have found that the HDR mode is useful for static shots or shots where there isn't a lot of movement. Lastly, this isn't a 10-bit drone, and while I wish it was, I think DJI is reserving that for the Mavic Pro lineup of drones. The second thing is, sometimes the drone just randomly stops moving and refuses to go forward, and I get vibrations from the controller telling me that something is blocking its path, even though it's way up in the clear sky with nothing in front of it. Now, I don't know if there's something happening with the wind speed, but why would the wind speed be different like 50 meters away at that kind of altitude? It doesn't make sense to me. But thankfully, you can put it in sport mode really quickly and safely bring it back. Now, I've had that happen to me a couple of times, so I thought I should share it with you. Third, and I've only had this happen to me once, but I have caught the propeller's shadow in a shot. And I didn't see it on my phone while shooting, but when I brought the footage back, you can see some flickering shadows on some parts of the footage. It went away on its own the further I flew, and I did end up salvaging the footage, messing with some deflicker settings in post. Lastly, and this is not a fault of the drone itself, but I feel like the UI in the DJI Fly app needs a lot of work. Specifically, when in quick shot modes, it always takes me a minute or two to figure out how to change the settings on it and how to initiate it. And also, the tracking mode itself is not the best. It's a bit late to start following you and sometimes will act strangely. But those are the only negative things that I've experienced with the Mavic Air 2, which in honesty are very minor. This is a fantastic drone and easily the best drone you can buy right now for less than $1,000. It checks all the boxes. Good looking 4K footage at 60 frames per second, check. Reliable and steady connection that never drops, check. Good battery life and flight time, check. Really good price, check, check. This drone is a winner. So that's it for this review, guys. I hope you liked it and found this informative. Please leave a like on this video, let us know what you think in the comments, go back and watch all my other videos, and subscribe to my channel. Till next time.